At its very core, drug science must remain independent. This means we don't accept sponsorships. It's with the support of the drug science community we're able to do this and make the podcast in the first place. If you're able to become a drug science community member and support the show, you too will be supporting the dissemination of evidence-based drug policies. Without you, none of this would be possible. For anybody interested, there's a link in the show notes. Thank you. Hello and welcome to the Drug Science Podcast with me, David Nutt. Here we're bringing together experts and activists for a rational, honest and informed conversation about drugs. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another podcast in the Drug Science series, 110 and counting. And today we have a very interesting pair of speakers, given permission to come outside the Westminster bubble and talk to you and me about research that they've been doing, particularly in relation to psychedelics and the potential utility of psychedelics. They're from the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology, and there's Jenny Chapman and Naulls. So I'm going to start off by asking them to introduce themselves because they're more interesting to hear their side of the story than my garbled interpretation. So I'll start with you, Jenny, since I think you're the person that first contacted me about this work. Tell us a bit about yourself and how do you get into the post room or whatever it's called?
The post office, yeah. The Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology, which I think from now on we'll just refer to as post if anyone hears that. Yeah, lovely to speak to you. My name is Jenny. I'm one of the biology and health advisors in post. I've been in the role for about a year now. I've got a background in biology and I came into the role from working in a slightly different team in Parliament where I was working on sort of engaging with the academic community and bringing researchers into Parliament. So yeah, that's me.
And Stephen?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. So my name's Dr. Stephen Naulls. I'm a medical doctor by background, currently completing my specialty training in psychiatry. David, you actually lectured me when I was at university, so thank you for steering me in the right direction.
Oh, thank you for listening.
No, thank you. And I first became involved in Parliament a few years ago when I was completing something called the National Medical Directors Clinical Fellow Scheme. So I worked as the clinical fellow for the Health and Social Care Select Committee for a year. That's the body of Parliament whose constitutional job is to scrutinise the Department of Health and Social Care. And then after that, I guess I got the bug for policy, and I wanted to see how scrutiny can take place in a slightly different way. And that's when I got introduced to colleagues at Post. And I've been very fortunate that my university, Brighton and Sussex Medical School, let me use a bit of my research time to contribute to policy work in Parliament. And so that's why I'm still around here doing this kind of briefing.
Oh, okay. So let me get this clear. So Jenny, you're a sort of professional scientist doing analytical work in Post.
Yeah, so I think I'd call myself a science communicator. So I'm a generalist biology and health advisor in Post. And to give you sort of an idea of sort of the breadth of topics that I've worked on since joining the role, the one on the briefing we're going to talk about today about psychedelic-assisted therapy was actually the very first one I got to sink my teeth into. But since then, I've written about cultivated meat. I've just published a briefing about orphan drugs. I'm currently working on winter mortality during a heat wave. That's going to be published very soon. And then once I publish that one, my next briefing is going to be about diagnosing and treating rare genetic diseases. So yeah, very much a sort of a generalist in the biology and health space and synthesizing evidence and sort of packaging it up for parliamentarians in the briefings that we write in Post.
And how many other people are there in Post?
Yeah, so we're a relatively small team. There's another person that works with me in the biology team, and then there's 3 other sub-teams within Post. So there's a team that works on social science topics, there's a team that works on digital and physical topics, and another team that work on energy and environment. But the reason that we're able to produce so much amazing research is that we host lots of fellows who come to work with us for anything from sort of 3 months. Some of our fellows work with us for a bit longer. And that means that, yeah, we welcome in, sometimes these are people who are working on their PhDs, sometimes they're more senior academics, and we work with them on one of these briefings. And it's a great sort of knowledge exchange because they get to understand more about how Parliament works, and we get to sort of offer them the opportunity to understand a bit more about how to communicate this kind of science. So Stephen can probably say more about this than me, as he's had that first-hand experience.
So, Stephen, did you apply, or were you plucked? Were you chosen?
So for the original fellowship with the Health and Social Care Select Committee, I applied. That's a competitive process that's led by the Faculty of Medical Leadership and Management. And then it was from working internally that I got offered the chance to continue working on the psychedelics work when I finished that particular fellowship. But what I would say to any early career researchers who are listening to this, anyone doing their PhD who's listening to this, one of the things that it seems like it's becoming more and more important to an academic career is engaging with policy. And so if you want to learn how the levers of Parliament work from a very early stage of your career, I'd absolutely recommend looking at the Post website, because there's always opportunities there to come and be seconded for a short period of time. I think we recently had one from the British Psychological Society. There's chemists that come to join us. So yeah, if this is something that kind of stands out to you as being something that you might be interested in, definitely check out the Post website and look at the fellowship opportunities.
So you're allowed to do that and continue your training as a doctor, which is really rather exciting.
Yes, you'll be familiar with it, David. So I'm an academic clinical fellow. So that means a quarter of my time I get to use for research purposes. And again, I'm fortunate that my university, Brighton and Sussex Medical School, are very supportive, and that they let me use a little bit of my time each week to contribute to policy work in Parliament.
That's great. Yeah, that's unusually flexible. So, congratulations on persuading them. Or maybe they had the right vision. Maybe that's why you chose Sussex in the first place. Who knows? Okay, so we've got that clear now. And then, you've obviously been very active. You've produced these 5 reports. So let's start with the beginning. Who initiates the report? Is that you or someone else? How does it work?
Yeah, I just want to flag the 5 reports that you mentioned. We'll include these in the show notes. These were some shorter briefings that considered the evidence base for specifically PTSD, eating disorders, depression, anxiety, and addiction. And they were looking at psychedelic-assisted therapy and the evidence for those conditions. And Stephen worked on those with a colleague of ours called Sarah Bunn. And whilst working on those, it sort of became clear that a complementary briefing was necessary to better understand the policy considerations. So that's, in the end, we actually published 6 briefings. And I can talk a little bit about how we came to focus on psychedelic-assisted therapy for a time in Post, if that's of interest.
Yeah, very much so, because I'm interested in who decides on what is of interest. So I guess you can tell us that.
Absolutely, yeah. So above all, Post is a team that aims to provide parliamentarians with the best available science evidence, a synthesis, so they can understand that science evidence in a topic. And that means that we're constantly looking for topics that are of interest in science and social sciences, looking at what parliamentarians are interested in. So we do that by sort of monitoring debates that are happening in the chamber. We're considering what kind of things are happening in select committees. So in the example of psychedelics, psychedelic-assisted therapy had come up in debates in the Chamber of the House of Commons. And also in 2023, there was a Home Affairs Committee report that talked about the legal status of some psychedelic drugs and clinical trials. So we knew that it was being discussed in various parts of Parliament. We knew that parliamentarians were interested in the topic. And then we're also monitoring what's going on outside of Parliament as well, because we're aiming to give parliamentarians these briefings at the right time. So we're sort of looking at all of the biology, well, in my team, the biology and the health space, to think, okay, what's an emerging topic? What's going to be of interest to parliamentarians for maybe the next 2 to 5 years? We could see that, as you all well know, lots of universities in the UK are working on psychedelic-assisted therapy clinical trials. We were aware that the UK was hosting a major international conference that was focused on psychedelic drug research. And we were also aware that there had been several high-profile books, and there were some films and some newspaper articles that had definitely increased the public interest in psychedelic drugs and their use in therapy. And we knew that was something that members were being asked about by their constituents. So for all of those reasons, this was a topic that we thought would be useful for parliamentarians. And it's that sort of process of understanding what is being discussed in Parliament and also what is being discussed outside of Parliament that informs what we work on. And if people are more interested in that, on the Post website, we have a section called Horizon Scan. And this is where we reach out to the academic community in this instance, and we ask them the kind of topics that should be on our radar for the sort of coming years. So if people are interested to see what sort of academics returned with when they were asked, there's several shorter articles on the Post website that have been published under the Horizon Scan section of our website.
So you come up with an idea, and you have to battle with your colleagues as to which one gets approved. And in the end, who does approve?
Yeah, great question. So the final approval happens at our board meetings. So in Post, we have a board that's made up of members of both the House of Commons and the House of Lords. There's also some senior academics that are representatives of some of the academies on the board as well, and also some senior staff members from what's called the House of Commons Library and the House of Lords Library, and some other senior people in Parliament who are involved in research. There's many more researchers behind the scenes in Parliament than people might be aware of. So all of those people on the Post board, when we meet with them every quarter as a team, myself and my colleague Claire, who's the other biology and health advisor. We present to them a list of topics that we've been thinking about. And as I said, through that process of monitoring what's happening inside of Parliament and outside of Parliament, we come up with a short list and we present it to the board, and then we discuss it in the board meeting. So the final say is those board members. And if you want to know more about those board members, they're all listed on the Post website.
Well, congratulations on getting psychedelics through. Over to Stephen. So I guess you were there, and then of course it was, kind of fell in your lap rather, didn't it? Given that this is psychotherapy and psychiatry, and I presume you received it with enthusiasm, given that Sussex is already beginning to work in this field. But tell us about your first thoughts when you were asked to be involved with this.
Well, yeah, so I think it's probably a good time to speak about some of the experience that I'd had before I came to work on the briefing. So since starting at the University of Sussex at Brighton Medical School, I've been helping out on a small scale on one of the phase 3 clinical trials that's taking place in the UK. That's the More Care trial. For people who don't know what that is, that's ketamine-assisted therapy for alcohol use disorder, which is being led by Celia Morgan at the University of Exeter. So I did have some kind of small, local, quite granular experience of psychedelic-assisted therapy trials. And also I have my own experience as a psychiatrist starting my training in psychiatry, and certainly seeing people with treatment-resistant depression and other complicated, serious mental illnesses, and this desire for us to develop new treatment options for them. And I suppose it was helpful to come at the briefing with that experience. But also, I would say, dovetailing that with a person with a scientific background, which isn't necessarily a medical background, made it quite a useful team, because it meant that I could explain some of the additional context about the medicine, but also that Jenny could be even more objective. And that's obviously one of the things that we're striving for with our briefings. We're being as impartial as possible, and we're trying to summarize all of the evidence that's out there from every perspective, so that members of the House of Lords and members of the House of Commons are able to come to informed decisions.
Are there many clinical fellows like you attached, or are you the only psychiatrist? Or?
It's a good question. I'm not sure how many psychiatrists there are in Parliament. I would say through Post and through initiatives like Post, there are people who are seconded into Parliament and who bring their experience and their expertise into Parliament. And I think that's to the benefit of Parliament. But also, in terms of like specific clinical fellows that there are, the Health and Social Care Select Committee, for instance, that has a clinical fellow every year. So there's been somebody that's replaced me year on year. I'm sure there's plenty of medical doctors popping kind of all over the place, popping around.
So, okay, so you get the thumbs up. Tell us all about, psychedelic psychotherapy. So then how do you set about writing a report? What's the strategy?
Yeah, so maybe it's useful to perhaps just say a little bit more about what Post does, because that will feed into explaining how we write those reports. So as I've mentioned, the remit is all about bringing the best available science and evidence into Parliament. And that's because, as Stephen mentioned, we're trying to support that scrutiny and debate that's happening in the House of Lords and the House of Commons. And it's perhaps a useful point to just mention that it can be sometimes easy to confuse Parliament and government. So Parliament is a unit that is checking and challenging the work of government, and through this scrutiny and debate that's happening in the chamber and in select committees, for example, and in other fora. So as Stephen mentioned, we are here to put together as an impartial evidence synthesis of a topic. And as I've mentioned, we've got this thorough process for working out which topics we should write about. So the way we go about it is first of all, we need to work out a scope. Often we're working on topics that we could write for years and years and years about a topic, but we need to make sure that we're producing a briefing that parliamentarian could read over a cup of coffee. So it's always a battle to sort of have a really tight scope on the topics that we're working on and make sure that we cram as much information into as few pages as possible. So the next part when we write our briefings is something that's really important about our work in Post, is that we don't just do sort of desk-based literature research. We're also, a big part of our work is consulting with experts in the space. So in the first sort of working on one of the briefings, we'll be thinking about who are the main voices in the space, who are the key stakeholders, because we're really trying to reflect the landscape of opinion that exists in any of the topics we're working on, be it winter mortality or psychedelic-assisted therapy. So we interview those experts. We always interview the relevant government departments. So for this one, we spoke to the Home Office, for example. And then we put together the information from that desk-based work and also from those stakeholder interviews and write the briefing. And it then goes through a really thorough peer review process. So it's reviewed internally by colleagues who have a lot of experience. And then it's also reviewed externally by, as I mentioned, those stakeholders in the space. They might be people that we've spoken to during the research, or they might be other people in the space. So we've got that sort of confidence that it's gone through that peer review process and it's being checked for accuracy and impartiality. And then it's published and it goes on our website. And excitingly, all of our briefings are completely freely available on the Post website for absolutely anyone to read. And there's some fascinating topics on there. Of course, I wish everyone would look.
They're not all drug sciencey topics.
Yeah, just in the last few weeks, there's been a really fantastic briefing about violence against women and girls in schools published, for example. And there's been a briefing about defending UK airspace and a briefing about PFAS forever chemicals. So my colleagues and I get to work on an amazing variety of topics.
And I think it's very important, the point you made earlier, that you're not pushing a party political line. I've been involved with Post probably for over 20 years now as an occasional reviewer and occasional sort of consultant. And what is very clear is that, you are independent. You're telling the truth. You're not pushing the party line. And it's really important people to understand that.
Ultimately, it's important for any MP of any party to be able to pick up one of our briefings and have complete confidence in it. So that's what we're striving for with every piece of work that we put out there.
Do you get feedback from parliamentarians? Do you actually seek out, do you ask them to peer review it or to read it and make sure? Some of the concepts are quite complex, I imagine, and they may be above some people's sort of level of understanding.
Yeah, that's one of my favourite parts of the job is trying to communicate really complex ideas in a really succinct, easy to understand way. And I hope that anyone with any background could pick up our briefings and understand what's going on. We occasionally get feedback from parliamentarians when the briefings are published. We always send them to our board members. We send them to parliamentarians that we know have an active interest in the topic. We also share them with relevant all-party parliamentary groups, sometimes called APPGs. So these are kind of a bit like sort of special interest groups in Parliament. They're quite informal. They don't have the same structure and sort of legislative role as a select committee, for example. But that's where you often get parliamentarians with a particular interest in a topic coming together. So yeah, we definitely have ways to share it. But as I said, all of the briefings are kind of on our website. We also have some physical copies that pop up around Parliament as well. So it's nice to walk around the Palace of Westminster and spot it. Stephen's holding one up now.
Stephen's holding it up. Good. Not that they can see this because they're hearing it. But...
Yeah, they do also exist as physical copies in Parliament as well as being the digital copies online.
They're in the library there. I didn't actually realise until you said it that the House of Lords and the House of Commons both have their own libraries. I'm wondering if maybe I should send my book on psychedelics to them.
Make sure you sign it first.
Can you write? Is there a librarian? You can just send.
Yeah. It was also something I wasn't familiar with before I joined Parliament. So in addition to there existing some incredibly beautiful physical libraries with books on the shelves, the House of Lords and the House of Commons Library are also a collection of incredible researchers who write briefings. They write briefings in a different way to how we write briefings in Post. They're much more kind of reactive in the topics that they're writing on. They're going to be topics that are sort of interest in the coming days or weeks, whereas we're looking at much longer term sort of emerging topics. So yeah, there's a fantastic team of researchers in both houses who are supporting the members of Parliament and the Lords with their work and sort of answering inquiries and providing these other briefings as well, which are also all available on the relevant website. So we'll pop some links to those in the show notes so people can have a look.
No, please do that. Please do. Hopefully it could be useful to parliaments or the equivalents in other countries as well, because as you say, you've got a good range, and also you've got the top. These topics are very, very tough.
Yeah, we are in Post. We're a member of an international organisation because there are some similar organisations to post around the world, and we're always sharing our briefings with one another. So yeah, that's definitely happening as well.
Well, that's interesting. So you're competing with others to see who can produce the fastest policy change. Well, maybe not.
I don't think so.
No, it's all about information, and then the process will go ahead. So you started to work in this field of psychedelics, and Stephen, obviously, you had the advantage of actually knowing a little bit about what it was about from your work on ketamine. Do you want to just explain to people why ketamine could be construed as a psychedelic? Do you want to just elaborate that a little bit? Because I mean, a lot of people, including I'm sure most parliamentarians, would think ketamine is just it's a horse tranquilizer and a drug of abuse, and obviously you know better.
Well, I don't know if I'd say that I know better or worse than any of the parliamentarians. I guess that one of the things that's challenging for our briefings is we're trying to communicate quite complex concepts. And obviously you'll be aware, and some of your listeners will be aware, that even within the field of psychedelics, whether or not ketamine is a psychedelic is actually a bit of an area of debate. And some people would argue that it is a psychedelic. Some people would argue that it isn't. Do you take a phenomenological approach to it because of the effects that it has, or do you take a purely pharmacological approach? I mean, we included it in the briefing because it's obviously got some quite advanced studies that are taking place, particularly in the UK, that are at phase 3 level.
Can I just say, I'll just interject here if I may. I mean, the study you're talking about, the Moracare study, is very much using ketamine as a psychedelic. It's, I think, 3 doses with preparation and integration afterwards, based on the CARE study from Exeter, which was a revolutionary study in moving ketamine out of the sort of remit of just some kind of tranquilizing antidepressant into something to facilitate insight and help people remodel their attitudes to alcohol. So I think, it's definitely evolving as a construct or as the utility or the way in which we use ketamine is definitely an evolving construct, isn't it? And you're part of that.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting seeing the way that a clinical trial is run on a local level and then coming up to this kind of national level and looking at the ways that policymakers might try to access information about how that's done. And one of the things that we tried to make really clear in the briefing, for example, is the kind of barriers that some researchers are describing around scheduling, and trying to make that as clear as possible for MPs and members of the House of Lords who might not have that kind of practical experience of running a clinical trial or being a part of a clinical trial.
Yeah, no, in fact, I want to come to that afterwards, but I think let's look at the science and the value first, and then we'll come to the challenges. So Jenny, I mean, I guess for you, this was probably your first deep dive into psychedelics in terms of what's going on, yeah.
Yeah, as I mentioned, I'm very much a generalist in the biology space. So it was great to read all the literature and also speak to lots of experts in the space. And the fun thing about working in post is you get up to speed on a topic extremely quickly, and then you get to sort of move on to the next one. So I feel very lucky to work here.
You came in presumably as any scientist would, with an open mind. And what were your main learnings? What did you discover that you were surprised by?
Yeah, so I can perhaps talk about a bit of the briefing that is maybe of interest. So maybe talk a little bit about the last section of the briefing. And although it does come at the end, and I know it's perhaps strange to start at the end, but we'll talk about some of the other bits as well. It is important to note that in post, as Stephen has mentioned, we're not coming to conclusions. We're not making recommendations. It's for the parliamentarians to sort of make their minds up. But something that I always enjoy working on in the briefings in post is this final section we often include in our briefings that's called the policy considerations. So when we're thinking about sort of the landscape of opinion in the space, and when we're delving into where the sort of debates and disagreements are in a topic, we sometimes want to highlight these in an impartial way so that parliamentarians can really understand all of the different points of view. And we can sort of highlight these active areas of debate. So when Stephen and I were researching this, 3 sort of came up that we thought particularly merited attention in through the research that we'd done, and we included these in the policy considerations section of our briefing. So the first we mentioned was stigma and acceptance. So we highlighted that this is something that the research was showing was both potentially an issue within the academic community and also in the public sphere. And David, this is perhaps something that you might have come across, the sort of concerns that researchers had, that the stigma associated with the Class A Schedule 1 drugs, and We've just been talking about ketamine, which is an exception here, which is Class B, Schedule 2, but perhaps we'll talk a little bit more about those differences. How that stigma could be potentially a barrier to psychedelic-assisted therapy research and clinical trials. We heard from researchers that there were sometimes challenges with approval by ethics committees, for example. And we also wanted to highlight that there's a sort of really complex and evolving landscape of opinion in the public sphere as well around controlled drugs and their use in psychedelic-assisted therapy. And there have been some interesting surveys that had been done looking at what those opinions were. And it's also really important to sort of highlight the counterfactual here, because we also wanted to acknowledge that there is a stigma around SSRIs, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, that are commonly prescribed for lots of the conditions that we were looking at in this briefing. So yeah, the first one was about stigma and acceptance. The second area we highlighted that researchers had suggested to us was important, and this is something I'm sure you'll be familiar with, the widespread confusion and conflation with people getting rescheduling and reclassification and prescription and decriminalization and legalization, getting those concepts that are sometimes a bit mixed up in the discourse. And this can make discussions quite messy sometimes. It can be quite tricky to understand sometimes. So in the briefing, because we were really trying to lay things out really clearly in this sort of impartial way, it was really important for us to be clear with the language and explain what those different concepts were, so that two people discussing psychedelic-assisted therapy could make sure that they were on the same page, make sure that they were both talking about the same thing and weren't sort of confusing schedules and classes, for example. And the last thing—
That's a briefing in itself.
It certainly is. There's lots more that researchers have to say on that topic. And yeah, lastly, we highlighted how the increased interest in psychedelic-assisted therapy. As I mentioned, there's been several high-profile books, and including yours, and films and newspaper articles. And we were interested it was important, based on our research, to highlight how this could potentially affect illegal use of psychedelic drugs. We knew that that's something that parliamentarians would be really interested in when they were reading our briefing and thinking about any potential changes to policy. So yeah, I thought that those were three bits that I mentioned, but we can definitely delve into other aspects of the briefing as well.
Good. And Stephen, from your perspective, I suppose, like I was when I was your age, I had very little understanding of all the complexities of scheduling and classification. In fact, I think the only reason I was appointed to the ACMD was because I eventually taught myself. I could then teach other people. But in clinical practice, it's not something you come across that much, is it?
Yeah, I mean, well, in psychiatry, I suppose more so than some of the other medical specialties, we've got to have a bit of a grasp of the law, but absolutely, I'm definitely more of a doctor than a lawyer. I mean, if it's helpful for listeners, we could explain the differences between scheduling and classification, and maybe where some of the confusion comes from in the public.
I think that would be a very good thing to do. Do you want to give it a go?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I guess the main piece of legislation that relates to this is a piece of legislation called the Misuse of Drugs Act from 1971. And basically that sets out two kind of parameters, I suppose, for approaching drugs: the classification system and the scheduling system. And focusing on the classification system first, so the class of drugs, that's either A, B, or C. And that's probably the system that most people who listen to your podcast will be familiar with, because that's the one that tends to get covered kind of mainstream media quite generally. So, for example, there's been discourse recently about ketamine, which you mentioned before, whether that should be reclassified, for example.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, Stephen, you're absolutely right. But it's the media only, it's always, someone's caught with a Class A drug. It's a Class A drug. I've never seen a media headline, someone caught with a Class B drug, but anyway, I guess that's a sort of natural tendency of the media. But you're right, the class is what people understand, because class tells you how severe the penalties are, really.
Yeah, effectively. So the way that I think about it in my head, and the way that I think we tried to kind of break it down in the briefing, is that the class relates to the level of punishment or the severity of punishment that an individual would receive if they were found in possession of a drug or if they were to supply a drug. Scheduling, however, and the schedule that a drug receives relates to how medically useful it is determined to be. And if a drug has no recognized medical utility, then it's put in Schedule 1, which all probably sounds a bit nebulous, but if we give an example, that probably helps people to contextualize it. So cocaine is a Class A drug. If you are supplying cocaine or found in possession of cocaine, you will get, in most cases, one of the harshest drug-related penalties for that. However, cocaine also has a medical use as a local anesthetic in some cases, which means that it's not in Schedule 1, it's in Schedule 2. So that is how we break down the difference between the class and the scheduling. I suppose where the crux of the issue is, or one of the cruxes of the issue, if cruxes even is a word, for this briefing, is that psychedelic drugs find themselves in Schedule 1. So, for example, psilocybin is a Schedule 1 drug, which means by the definition of the scheduling system that there is no recognized medical utility for it. People active in the psychedelics research space would argue, or may argue, that that's no longer accurate because there is this emerging evidence base. And that's why some people push for the rescheduling of certain drugs. I should say it's Post's role to be balanced and impartial. There are people who would say that the rescheduling of these kinds of drugs might lead to them being more readily available for illicit use, and for them somehow being diverted into kind of a legal trade. And that's one of the counter arguments that people might make to the rescheduling of certain drugs. It's important that I'm balanced.
Yeah, but I suppose one of the interesting questions is how you evaluate that balance. Because and now I think one of the issues that obviously come across and is rather almost peculiar to the UK is that you've got two different government departments involved. You've got the Department of Health and Social Care, who presumably care about the health benefits, and you've got the Home Office, who are largely concerned about the misuse, aren't they? Were you able in any way to sort of bring those two together in your conversation?
I don't think it's our responsibility as Post to try and bring different government departments together. What we try to do with our briefings is to put the evidence out there in a way that's accessible for whether it be a minister or a backbench MP to access in a way that they find helpful. I suppose that one thing that's happened in the interim since we published the report is that the government has published its response to the ACMD's recommendations on barriers to research. And one of the main outcomes from that, I suppose, was the acceptance in principle that some Schedule 1 drugs which are being researched in universities may not need to have a Home Office license anymore and could be treated as if they were in Schedule 2.
Yeah, we were clarifying a little bit for the audience that the challenges that being a Schedule 1 drug bring to researchers. I mean, did you want to do that, Jenny?
Yeah, I could talk a little bit about that. So in the briefing, we spoke to researchers in universities who had first-hand experience of running randomized control trials into looking at psychedelic-assisted therapy. And we talked to them about some of the challenges that they felt were associated with that. And there's some literature that we reference in the briefing that also researchers are explaining what some of they feel some of those challenges are. So one of them is the cost, basically, and another is that we heard being talked about from the research community were the logistic challenges. So some of the costs that researchers said were associated with these clinical trials were the Home Office license that Stephen mentioned. And it's, to be clear here, we're talking about substances in Schedule 1, as we've recognised ketamine. Some people consider it a psychedelic, some don't. It is in Schedule 2, so it'd be slightly different for ketamine, but maybe psilocybin as an example here. So there's fees associated with getting a license from the Home Office and some paperwork associated with that some researchers flagged was quite logistically difficult. And there's also some safeguards. So, for example, DBS checks for staff involved in the research. It was also highlighted to us that acquiring the substances from manufacturers had barriers in terms of sort of import and export licenses and storage facilities. And then also some of the sort of physical infrastructure that universities and hospitals running these clinical trials. Because to be clear, we're talking about clinical trials being done in controlled environments. These are universities and hospitals, often university hospitals working together. And the building requirements from the Home Office involve things like the Schedule 1 drugs being in a lockable fridge freezer that's bolted to the door, and there's CCTV in the room. And this is to prevent the diversion and misuse. So diversion is when these drugs are sort of taken out of the hospital setting, and misuse is where they're not used for their intended use in psychedelic-assisted therapy. And also the sort of staff time associated with submitting the applications and sort of managing those licensing requirements. So there's an overview of some of the sort of financial and logistical barriers that researchers explained to us were some of the challenges they felt with doing these clinical trials.
I think that's really important that you've done that, because only people who are in the field, like myself, really understand it and really have experienced it. And I suspect a lot of people would be slightly kind of, wow, is it that difficult? And it is, I think, as you highlighted, that's right. So the idea that is developed that Stephen mentioned is the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs has recommended quite some time ago that maybe that academic centres and hospitals should be exempt from Schedule 1 controls in the same way as they're exempt from Schedule 2 controls. So, there is this sort of paradox, that many people think, well, why can I work on cocaine as a Schedule 2 when I can't work, on psilocybin, which is Schedule 1, because surely cocaine's more dangerous and also more likely to be sought after by. So I think if the pilot studies can be up and get up and running and show it safe for academic institutions to work with some Schedule 1 drugs like psilocybin as if they were Schedule 2, then that would actually massively facilitate research.
Yeah, that's one of the perspectives that we definitely heard from the stakeholders that we interviewed for the briefing.
So already you may have had an impact.
It's definitely not.
It's come out. Yeah, okay. Well, at least your report came out first, so they're highlighting it. So I'm happy for you to take credit. I mean, of course you should. Right, but so I think you both know that there was a sort of self-fulfilling this catch-22 paradox, wasn't there? Why is it? You talk about it. You've spoken about it. So
I'll have a go at explaining it. It's quite a tricky one to explain, so strap in. So, yeah, this phrase "catch-22" was used in a Commons chamber debate about psychedelic drugs in 2023. So I'll actually just read the quote in full. It's from the then Minister for Crime, Policing and Fire. So they said, "There is an element of chicken and egg or catch-22 about the situation, because we need to do the research before there is an evidence base to justify the rescheduling that might be merited." So I'll have a go at explaining what they mean by that. And as I said, there's more about this in the briefing. But in essence, the researchers we spoke to the briefing, as I've said, highlighted how logistically difficult and expensive they have found it to conduct large trials with controlled drugs in Schedule 1. So as our shorter briefings that were published in the last couple of years have shown, there's been a number of smaller trials. I mean, by smaller, I'm talking about sort of trials that perhaps have between maybe 10 to about 30 participants. Stephen, would you agree that's the sort of numbers that have occurred so far?
I'd lean more on David's expertise.
That's a reasonable. That's a absolute. No, you're covered the range.
Those kind of sizes, and the researchers we spoke to explained to us that they were keen to conduct larger randomized controlled trials, but the costs and the logistics associated with that were tricky. So things that I mentioned, for example, the Home Office license. So that's what they were telling us was one reason why the trials thus far have been on the smaller side. And the researchers that we spoke to were telling us that they were really interested to be running larger trials. And this is because, as I'm sure many of your listeners are aware, to find out if a treatment is safe and effective, you need larger sample sizes. And that means more people. And it often means people from different locations around the country, or perhaps from different countries, which again, can add to the logistical challenges. So it's evidence from those large trials the researchers were interested in to find out if psychedelic drugs have this are safe and effective for the treatment of specific mental health conditions. But as Stephen has explained, the majority of psychedelic drugs, with the exception of ketamine, are in this Schedule 1 group. And the definition there is that drugs that have no medicinal value. And this is where this kind of element of chicken and egg comes in, because the researchers we spoke to explained to us that they felt that the very fact that these drugs are in Schedule 1 is the reason that the large trials can't take place to determine if that position in Schedule 1 is or isn't accurate. So they explained some of the phrases they used to us were things like circular reasoning, and it's where those comments that I mentioned from the chamber debate came in. And the concern from some of the researchers we spoke to was that some of these psychedelic drugs that they were the small trials that had been conducted so far suggested that there might be some medicinal value. They were going to be sort of perpetually stuck in this Schedule 1 group because of the difficulties with doing a larger trial to gather the evidence to determine if they have medicinal value. And you can see where it all gets quite confusing. So that was something that we tried really hard in the briefing to explain as clearly as possible. I hope my explanation there didn't confuse
No, you
anyone.
did explain it. You did explain it very well. Absolutely. So just coming back to you, Stephen. So as a clinician now who's worked with ketamine, and you've obviously read the literature now on the other psychedelics, psilocybin, DMT, LSD, and those reports. What's your take as a psychiatrist on what you read and what you learned?
So I'm going to be boring in response to that one and say I'm here to represent Post as a body and not here in my capacity as an individual psychiatrist. With that in mind, obviously if a medicine or an intervention undergoes the appropriate phase 1, 2, 3 trials, gets a product license from the MHRA, and then is deemed cost effective by NICE and available on the NHS, then as a psychiatrist, I would prescribe medications that had undergone that process. Psychedelic-assisted therapy has not yet passed through all of those hoops, of course.
No, I suppose I was wondering if you were hopeful that the future, you might have more choice than just ketamine. Well, I'm hopeful. You don't have to.
Well, yeah, as somebody who's at the start of their career, I remember when I spoke to my personal tutor when I was at medical school, and they told me that they came through in the golden age of when we were expecting all these breakthrough drugs for Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia, and then that they kind of didn't come to fruition. So I'd like to think, as a relatively junior psychiatrist, that there are going to be more and more options available for people with severe mental illness. So I'll be optimistic and say, yes, this might be one of them, but also there might be other options that are available too. But as long as we have something, that's good. Yes,
and I think hopefully you will have made a contribution, at least. Well, you've definitely made a contribution to the debate, and that's the start of decision making. So, because if we don't, obviously, if we don't break the catch-22, then we're going to not ever get to a situation where we'll have enough confidence.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting seeing the kind of the dichotomy between a really controlled clinical environment of a phase 3 trial like Morecare, for example, where ketamine is being used in a psychedelic way but in a really controlled manner, and my other research interest, for example, which is chemsex and sexualized drug use, which is where ketamine is very much being used for some of its psychedelic properties but in a completely uncontrolled and different way. And I suppose that it was important in the briefing to make clear the exact reason that ketamine was being used and the really controlled way that ketamine was being used.
I think that's so important. Yeah, absolutely, because I think there's still a big misperception that psychedelics are being used as they were when they were widely used recreationally in the 50s and 60s. And I suspect most people don't realize it. We're using them in a very intensive psychotherapeutic way.
And I think that was the other thing to kind of disambiguate for people. It's not like, as a psychiatrist, you're going to write a prescription for MDMA or psilocybin, and then somebody's going to walk out, pick that up from a pharmacy and take it in the street. I think that's what some of the misconceptions are. But actually, it's in a very controlled environment, and certainly in the studies, it's an even more controlled environment. It was important to make that clear in the briefing as well, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the strengths of what you said, Jenny.
Yeah, I was just going to say we go into some detail in the briefing about the sort of 4 stages. The screening, which is really important. The researchers were saying that's a really key part of this. Preparation, the psychedelic experience itself, which is the bit that everyone focuses on. But it's one part of these. It's only one part in the sort of 4-stage process, and then integration being the final stage there.
Just explain to people what that is in case they don't know.
Yeah, sure thing. So first of all, the screening that happens in a clinical trial here is both physiological and psychological. So a doctor would screen a clinical trial participant for things like cardiovascular health, and also for a sort of history and family history of mental illness like schizophrenia. And that screening is really important to make sure that any potentially vulnerable patients are excluded from the trial and can be offered a different treatment. And it's the same way that a doctor would screen somebody before prescribing an SSRI. Screening is an important part of lots of medical procedures. And I think this is an example of an area where the kind of briefing that we write in Post can be really valuable in terms of assessing the evidence, because, as you've said, there's lots of ways that people around the world are using these substances, and you wouldn't want to, for example, compare the outcomes and the evidence from a randomized controlled trial looking at psychedelic-assisted therapy, say you had one where screening did take place and one where screening didn't take place, and you were considering the outcomes, that wouldn't really be a fair comparison to make. And also something that we through doing our research, we knew it was important to highlight in the briefing. It's important to recognize that the data does exist that's looking at how people are taking these substances recreationally, where there's definitely not that kind of screening preparation aspect that occurs in the clinical trials. It's not happening in a controlled clinical setting. It's not supervised. So we also really wanted to highlight that it's important to not compare evidence and outcomes from recreational use with hospital and university-based clinical trials. So we highlighted that in the briefing when we, for example, were talking about side effects. So yeah, that's an example of how what we do in post is kind of tease out those tricky to understand ideas.
Well, I can say, I think you both done a great job. I think we're citing your papers all the time and all around the world. So I thank you both for doing it. And I have little doubt that they'll be part of the process of proper evaluation of how we further develop research on these drugs and eventually come to decision making on them. So
it's always great to hear that they're useful and being read by all sorts of different people. As we say, our main customers are the MPs and peers, but we're very aware that our briefings get read by all sorts of other people around the world. So that's really nice to hear.
So thank you again. And I just want to say, I may not have sent you, but I would like to, I don't know if you have a post office, but maybe we'll, or a post library, but Drug Science we did a review. I don't know if I shared it with you, but we did a review of 50 years of drug policy to celebrate, to coincide perhaps with the 50 years of the Misuse of Drugs Act. And I would be very happy to send a copy to you or to your office or to either of the Lords or Commons libraries. So perhaps afterwards, if one of you, probably you, Jenny, tell me who to send these volumes to, I will do that, because they've got some quite interesting overviews of other drugs as well, which at some time in the future, it's quite likely that might also come under your purview.
Very interesting. Thank you.
So thanks again, and I'll wind up now.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.